was beautiful.
Kind of like behind the camels. You should be okay. I mean, and if you're not, well, some. None of those are. You'll just take this one.
Welcome, Shabbat Shalom. So nice to see people. They are. No. Because it's Rosh Chodesh, right? I'll do this whole thing. I'll make it fast. It actually is Rosh Chodesh there. It feels right.
Sure.
Because it isn't like it's an announcement. It actually is the month.
Yeah.
No?
Perfect.
Fine.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, maybe tomorrow. Yeah.
Cool. I mean, it's for us too, but I would just do it with the person in such a language as I think we're ready. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
How did I miss that when you walked in?
Welcome to those online as they come on in.
Welcome, Zoomiverse and YouTubeverse.
Welcome, everyone. We're going to begin on page 24 with the words of Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem, Malachi Hasharet, Malachi Elyon, Ami Melech, Malchi Hamlavim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Bachem Boachem Leshalom, Malachi Hashalom, Malachi Elyon, Ami Melech, Malchi Hamlavim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Baruchuni L'Shalom, Malachi Shalom, Malachi Elyon, Melech, Malachi Hamlavim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Seitchem L'Shalom, join us. Seitchem L'Shalom, Malachi. Clap your hands with us. Malachi Elyon, Melech, Malachi Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shalom Aleichem, Shalom Aleichem, Malachi Hasharet, Malachi Elyon, Melech, Malachi Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Welcome, everybody.
Welcome.
So good to be together. It's really, really nice to see
Yeah,
your faces.
I have to say that there are people who are in this room who I don't feel like I've seen in person in a very, very long time, and it's wonderful to see you. I don't know what's brought you out tonight. Maybe it's maybe it's that you're just feeling comfortable. Maybe it's the fact that we're finally going to start eating together and our own egg is back, right? Maybe it's our guest speaker tonight, who I'm really excited to hear from. And because of the wonders of Zoom and the different world that we live in, pre-pandemic, I was saying that I wanted to be able to bring a speaker in from California that we couldn't afford to fly out, but to have them from California and just be here. And people kind of looked at me askance about 2 years ago and said, that's not really the same thing. And now we're able to do that. And so we have a really wonderful speaker in Bruce Haynes who's going to be addressing us tonight from the comfort of his own home in California. Maybe it's just the state of the world. And I need Shabbat, and I imagine many of us do too. I was scrolling through Facebook the other day, and I saw a picture that was actually posted by our member Greg Kahn on his Facebook feed. And it was the picture of a child, and next to the child was a bag fully packed, and a father in tears. And the caption was that this girl was leaving Ukraine to find a place of safety. That's why her bag was packed. And the father was crying because he wasn't going with her. He was going to stay and he was going to defend his country. And Greg wrote the words, and I'm sure he would be fine with me saying this, I don't think I can do any work today. And that's a little how I'm sure many of us have been feeling as we've been watching different pieces of the world crumble around us. And so Shabbat is meant to be a respite from that. Look, the world will still be broken 25 hours later. But if you can add a little bit more light, if you can pause from the worry, if you can let those fears go, you're going to find that they're much more productive when you need to pick them back up on Saturday night. And so for as much as you can, let that picture go. Let that fear go. Let that worry go. Don't forget about what's going on in the world. Add your prayers to the mix. But for 25 hours, for the length of Shabbat, try to hold in tension the need to find a little bit of light and joy along with the brokenness around you. And the way to do that, the mnemonic, the reminder, is the flickering flame, the candle. And so, speaking of joy on Shabbat, I'm going to call Devin up to be joined by her parents and her brother as in honor of her becoming bat mitzvah tomorrow. They together light the candles and lead us in Kiddush. So come on up.
As these Shabbat candles give light to all who behold them, so may we, by our lives, give light to all who behold us. As their brightness reminds us of the generations of Israel who have kindled light, so may we, in our own day, be among those who kindle light.
No rush.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lehadlik ner, Shal Shabbat.
O source of light and truth, creator of the eternal law of goodness, help us to find knowledge by which to live. Lead us to take the words we shall speak into our hearts and our lives. Bless all who enter this sanctuary in need, all who bring the offerings of their hearts. May our worship lead us to acts of kindness, peace, and love.
Ready?
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu v'shabbat kodsho be'ahava uvratzon hinhilanu zikaron lema'aseh v'reishit ki hu yom tehila lemikra'ei kodesh zecher litziat mitzrayim Kivanu v'charta v'otan kidashta mikol ha'amim v'shabbat kodshecha be'ahava uvratzon hinhaltanu Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh haShabbat.
Congratulations. We're on page 20 as we join together in the words of Lecha Dodi. And I did forget to say, as I was talking about all the different things that might have drawn people, I'm really jazzed to have the band back, especially we've got a wind section for the first time, I think, since the pandemic.
We do.
So
We do.
we're on page number 20.
לך דודי לקראת קלה פני שבת נקבלה 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 שמור וזכור בדיבור אחד, השמיענו אל המיוחד, אדוני אחד ושמו אחד, ושמו תפארת ולתחילה, לך דודי, לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה, לך דודי, לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לקראת שבת לכו ונלכה, כי היא מקור הברכה, מראש מקדם נסוכה, סופה עצב במחשבה תחילה.
Let's hear you. לך דודי.
לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי, לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. Verse 5, התעוררי, כי בורך ומיורי, שיר דברי, כי כבוד אדוני עלייך נגלה. לך דודי, לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי, לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה.
We rise if we're able.
בואי ושלום עטרת בעלה, גם בשמחה ובצולה, תוחמוני עם הסגולה. בואי חלה, בואי חלה. לך דודי, לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. Shabbat nikabela.
We remain standing, page 28.
Barechu et Adonai hamevorach. Baruch Adonai
Baruch Adonai
hamevorach
Hamevorach
leolam
Leolam
va'ed.
Barechu et Adonai Hamevorach Barechu et Adonai
Hamevorach.
Baruch Adonai Hamevorach Leolam va'ed Baruch Adonai Hamevorach
Baruch Adonai Hameolam.
va'ed
Barechu et Adonai Hamevorach.
Barechu et Adonai Hamevorach. We're seated together as we turn our attention to the screen. פותח בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח שערים. בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח שערים.
Before the wind of before the sun I faint, I lose my strength, I lose my strength.
בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח שערים.
בחוכמה,
בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח שערים.
vanquished by your star, I go to my knees. I lose my strength, I lose my strength.
בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח שערים. בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח שערים.
Before the song of a bird, before the breath of spring or fall, I am lost, nothing at all.
Let's hear you. בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח שערים. בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח בחוכמה, פותח שערים.
Before the miracles, ברוך אתה אדוני המרעיב ערבים.
Page 32.
אהבת עולם, בית ישראל, עמך אהבת, עמך אהבת. תורה ומצוות, חוקים ומשפטים, אותנו לימדת, אותנו לימדת.
כן אדוני אלוהינו בשוכבנו ובקומנו נשיח בחוקיך
ונשמח בדברי תורתך ובמצוותיך לעולם ועד.
כי הם
חיינו ואורך ימינו ובכם נגה יומם ולילה, נגה יומם ולילה. ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו
לעולמים. ברוך אתה אדוני
אוהב עמו ישראל.
אוהב עמו ישראל.
שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Page 36.
ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודך. והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך, ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ושוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני
אדוני אלוהיכם.
אדוני אלוהיכם אמת.
Page 41. Sing the song of men and women joined in understanding and respect. The song of God's miracles, an earth protected and cherished, a gift for our children and the generations to come. The song of a land once ravished by war, now quiet and content, her soldiers home to leave no more. The song of a world redeemed, the song of peace. Page 40.
Ba'elim Adonai. Join us. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai. Mi kamocha nehedar b'kodesh. Nora tehilot osef elef. Nora tehilot osef elef. Malechutecha ra'u evanecha. בוקע הים לפני משה ומרים. זה אלי, אנו ואמרו. זה אלי, אנו ואמרו.
Let's hear you.
אדוני לו לעולם ועד. אדוני לו לעולם ועד. One more time. ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב וגלו מיד חזק ממנו ברוך אתה אדוני גאל
Top of page 43. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Adonai, help us to walk with good companions, to live with hope in our hearts and eternity in our thoughts, that we may lie down in peace and rise up, waiting to do your will. Baruch atah Adonai haporesu kat shalom aleinu, ve'al kol amo Yisrael, ve'al Yerushalayim.
Amen.
Bottom of page 44.
ישמחו במלכותך שומרי שבת בקורא עונג שבת ישמחו במלכותך שומרי שבת בקורא עונג שבת מקדשי שבי שבת כולם ישבעו ויתענגו מטובך שבת.
Let's hear you. ישמחו
במלכותך שומרי שבת בקורא עונג שבת ישמחו במלכותך שומרי שבת בקורא עונג שבת והשבי רצית בו וקידשו שבת חמדת ימים אותו קראת שבת ישמחו במלכותך שומרי שבת בקורא עונג שבת ישמחו במלכותך שומרי שבת בקורא עונג שבת זכר למעשה בראשית שבת זכר למעשה בראשית שבת ישמחו במלכותך שומרי שבת בקורא עונג שבת ישמחו במלכותך שומרי שבת מקורא וקורא עונג שבת.
We turn to page 46 and we rise together. And after this opening meditation, we move into silence through page 64, either praying the traditional words or the words of our heart.
Adonai sefatai tiftach ufi yagid tehilatech
Adonai sefatai tiftach ufia tehilatecha.
I invite you to take as much time with your own private prayers as you need. It only elevates all of us. And for those who are ready, we come back for another moment to pray a prayer for peace. May it come now, speedily, soon. And may the blockades from our hearts to those who do not want peace in this world, may we reach them with our prayers. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Ki ata hu melech adon lechol Shalom lechol Shalom, ki ata hu melech adon lechol Shalom. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amecha tasim leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amecha tasim leolam. V'tov be'enecha livarech et amecha Yisrael b'chol עת ובכל שעה בשלומך. שלום רב על ישראל עמך תשים לעולם. שלום רב על ישראל עמך תשים לעולם. תשים לעולם. תשים לעולם.
turn to page 253 as we have this opportunity each time we gather together to offer a mishaberach, a prayer for those in need of healing of body, mind, and soul. And in a moment, we'll turn our eyes to the screen and you'll see a listing and ask you to please join me in the prayer. Mishaberach avotenu v'imotenu, Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, v'Leah, hu yivarech et hacholim. May the one who blessed our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, bless and heal those who are ill. Please add names of those that you're offering a mishaberach for. May the Blessed Holy One be filled with compassion for their health to be restored and their strength to be revived. May God swiftly send them a complete renewal of body and spirit, and let us say amen. And for those on Zoomiverse, add names in the chat as well. Mishaberach avotenu mekor habracha limotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say amen. Mishaberach imotenu mekor habracha liavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say amen.
We're going to move now, page 282, as we rise for Aleinu.
Sorry. Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol, latet kedula liotzer breshit, shelo asanu kigoye haratzot, velo samanu kemishbechot adama, shelo samchelkenu kahem, vegoralenu kechol hamonam, vanachnu korim, umishtachavim umodim, lifnei melech malchei hamlachim, hakadosh baruch hu. V'nemar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz. Bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad, ushemo echad.
We pause for a moment and we think of those who we have loved and who we have lost, those very much in our minds and in our thoughts. This Shabbat, we recall the following individuals: Rudolph Adler, Marvin Alpern, Blanche Bedrin. Leonard Berman, Leah Busin, Robert Cohen, Hona Cohen, Nettie Cook, Barry Edelman, Madeline Ezrin, James Gary, Milton Genzer, Edward Green, Samuel Greenfield, Irving Hertzberg, Renee Jacobson, Samuel Kaiserman, Rose Coulter, Ralph Kaufman, Mara Kochba, Bernice Kramer, Saul Crone, Jack London, Lillian Lustgarten, Maxine Martin, Ignacia Melendez del Olivas, Bernard Novak, Morton Raymond, Bertha Rosenberg, May Rubin, Manning Schreiner, Lillian Schumann, Joan Shapiro, Donald Shaw, Lena Slater, Morton Stagoff, Philip Stein, Harold Sterling, Anna Tobias, Ernest Toke, David Tucker, Susan Wachstein, Patrice Weingast, Michael Weinstein, Joseph Yorish, Gary Zaslav, and Edward Zuckerman. And those who are in their Shiva and Shloshim periods of mourning: Salvatore Marchesi, uncle of Laura Marchesi, Sheila Richter, mother of Amy Clayman, and Ellen Berman, mother of Doug Berman. In addition, I'll ask you if you're able to share names of anybody for whom you are in your one-year period of mourning for, or that you're observing a yard site that may not have been on this list. And if you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to put those names into the chat. We turn to page 294 and we join together. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah, v'yamad divrach yiratei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayachon yom echon uv'chayed l'chol beit Yisrael, ba'gala uv'izman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shlama Rabbah men Shemaya. Yehei mevarach li'olam ulamei almaya. Yiparach v'ishtabach v'ipa'ar v'itramam v'itnaseh. V'itadar v'italev v'italal shemeda kudasha b'richu. Le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbachata v'nechamata. Damiram b'yama v'imru amen. Yehei shlama Rabbah min Shemaya. V'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav. Huya aseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. May the source of peace send peace to all who mourn and comfort to all who are bereaved. As together we say, amen. Please be seated. Wow, I haven't messed up the Kaddish since I was a song leader at Eisner. So a few announcements before we end with our closing song, and then we move into our speaker tonight, and I'll formally introduce our speaker, and of course thank all those that made our speaker possible. Look, we've got a number of great programs coming up. We just added a program to the calendar that's in 2 weeks. I really want to flag it for you because I'm really excited about this. The Jerusalem Open House came to us and said to us, look, we're going to be in town, can we come by? And I jumped at the opportunity. The Jerusalem Open House is basically the LGBTQ center of Jerusalem. They put on Jerusalem Pride. They do a lot of the kind of suicide counseling that needs to get done with young people who are coming out of the closet in Jerusalem. And not only that, they also are a major advocate in the Knesset to make sure that no bills get passed that are anti-LGBTQ by the Haredim. And so I really want to encourage you to come to that. They're going to be coming here. This is in person, though of course it'll be hybrid, on Sunday night the 13th. Purim is also coming. And look, the thing about TNT and Purim is it lasts basically all month. And so on the 13th, we've got our Purim Carnival. On the 16th, which is actually Purim, we have an intergenerational reading. I love when Purim happens to fall on Wednesday night, so we organically have all our teens here. And so if you are not a teenager, you are encouraged still to come. We'll have an intergenerational reading with the teens and whoever from the community shows up. And then we'll break up into a host of classes and activities to do, from mask making to cooking to, I think I'm probably going to find 3 movies with the same scene from from the Purim story, and we'll talk about movie as Midrash.
We're going to work with unmasking. That's what we're working on. Unmasking.
So come to the reading, come to the classes. It'll be awesome. And then Purim Spiel is going to be on the 19th. It's called Moth Gilla, and it's playing on all those radio and podcasts that you've gotten to love over the course of the past couple of years. And so come, it'll be wonderful. The 19th. Cantor, you've got a special guest that you're bringing to the congregation.
Women's History Month is coming in a few days, and so is the new month of Adar Bet, and they are going to almost coincide. And so on Tuesday evening, March 1st, just this coming Tuesday night, a dear friend and someone who's been a visitor to Ner Tamid many years over the years, but now has a whole new shtick, the Rebbitzin from Maine, or the Maine Rebbitzin actually is what she goes. She has a great podcast called the Poo 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 Podcast. And she's an extremely funny lady, and we're just going to have a good laugh for Adar, so please, we need a laugh. March 1st, come online, 8 p.m.
Awesome.
All are welcome.
So look, check out our website, check out our e-blast. We got tons of other stuff going on, and we're going to close today with that call for peace. Oseh Shalom.
Thank you, the band, lifting us up, lifting all of our hearts and souls so far up. I'm barely on the ground. Bring us in. Someone start playing. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. We have another go at it. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu. Let's hear you. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. One more time. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol yoshvei tevel. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. Amen, amen. Amen, band. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. So we're going to transition to our speaker now. So as I mentioned before at the beginning of our service, one of the amazing things about the world that we live in is that we're able to hear from people and to learn from people that we wouldn't often get a chance to hear from and to learn from because they live so far away and because once upon a time you had to fly them out, you had to put them up, and to have somebody just come and speak for Friday night would have been prohibitive. You could have only gotten somebody from the New York area. And so we're so excited to be able to welcome Professor and Dr. Bruce Haynes to the screen. I want to tell you just a bit about who he is, and then I want to invite anybody who can't see to move closer so you can see the screen. And he's going to be joining us for the next about half hour or so to talk to us about the intersection between racism and anti-Semitism, the place of Black Jews in the Jewish community, and he's a talented speaker. He is a professor. I'll let people transition if they're moving first. He's a professor at UC Davis, and he's in the sociology department in the African American Studies department, and is also a senior fellow at the Urban Ethnography Project at Yale University. Professor Hayes has written about a lot of things. Most notably, he has a new book, The Jews of African Descent, which I have a copy of and got a chance to page through this week. Really interesting and worth checking out. In addition to that, we knew about Bruce because he was one of our panelists when we showed the movie Shared Legacies, which is about the history of kind of Jewish and African-American struggles for freedom, specifically around the 60s, but really in the whole of the 20th century. The problem with a large panel, there were 5 people on the panel, is that somebody really awesome only gets to speak for about 7 minutes of a panel. And so we knew that Bruce had a lot to offer, and so Professor Haynes had a lot to offer, and we wanted to bring him back. And I have no doubt that he will be as engaging in these next half hour as he did hooking me, at least for those 7 or so minutes total that we got to see him speak. A few thank yous. The first is to Shirley Colbert, who is joining us on the screen right now. She sponsored tonight in memory of her late husband, Mac, and we're so thankful that she has such a dedication to justice that she has put this series together where we've been bringing these speakers in. In addition, I want to thank Carrie Shavat and Bud Mishkin, who really had the idea to bring a speaker and said to me and pushed me and said, look, Black History Month is coming up. This is really important that we do something here. And so for working on this and to make it happen, thank you to the two of them. So without further ado, I want to welcome to the screen Dr. Professor Bruce D. Haynes. And I don't know if you could hear them, but everybody was cheering for you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. So first, let me just try to adjust my screen, because there's nothing more disconcerting than staring at yourself when you're giving a talk. But I'm not sure I can. Oh, okay, perfect. Now I got the gallery. Thank you so much for the warm welcome, and it's exciting to be back here with you this evening. It's only 4:30 in the afternoon here in California, and it's a little bit sunnier and warmer than I imagine you folks are feeling right now out there in Jersey. But it's a real pleasure to be with you. So let me tell you a little bit about what I normally do is I've written about Jews of African descent in the U.S. The book is right behind me. You can see it there on the shelf. And I often give much more scripted talks about the changing demography of the Jewish community. I give some updates about different surveys and how the changing demographics have increased folks of color. And I often talk about how people in my sample talked about experiencing both anti-Semitism and racism. And so sort of being a Black Jew is sort of like being between a rock and a hard place, so to speak. So they got it from both sides. But instead today, I'm going to move away from my normally scripted plan. I'm going to get out of my comfort zone a little bit and go just from a handful of notes that I've written it down to try to talk a little bit about that intersection of racism and anti-Semitism. And I guess I'd kick off with reminding us about Whoopi Goldberg and the recent controversy that she has found herself in talking about the Holocaust and suggesting that the Holocaust has nothing to do with race. Well, there are a couple of reasons I think Whoopi made that mistake. Number one, many Americans think race is simply color. And race is much more than color. Color might be an indicator of race at times, but it is not the sole indicator of race. And in fact, we have many Afro-Americans who can pass for white, for example, who are still framed as Afro-American. And so the way we classify race has a social, cultural set of rules that go along with it. Here we use the one-drop rule that's been in effect since the late 19th century. So any Black person who has any person who has any African ancestry is classified as a Black person. The other thing, we often think of race as identity. So Whoopi clearly got into some trouble, and part of the trouble is partly that we don't understand the interrelationship of anti-Semitism and racism and how these two things have intertwined at different stages of history. So, for example, in Nazi Germany, Whoopi didn't know that the Nuremberg laws that were instituted there that were really racializing Jews, making being Jewish something based on heredity and ancestry, and that is akin to race. The Nuremberg laws were based on American segregation laws, which were framed around this notion of the one-drop rule. So she didn't understand, in fact, how deeply aligned the conversation of race has been historically between the United States and Germany. The other thing we don't understand is that anti-Semitism and racism have had a long dialogue in history. And what's challenging is that they're not exactly the same thing, but they are intertwined in a fascinating way with regards to how Jews have been seen in particular historically. So, for example, we're really talking about the way in which anti-Semitism and racism are linked in a long conversation that begins in Christianity, that first frames Jews as the killer of the Christian Christ, that blames them for it beginning in the early stages of the Catholic Church. And that framing of Jews as against the church, as maybe aligned with the devil, was embedded in early Christian teachings. So with anti-Semitism, what you tend to see is a layering of these narratives, one over the other, and the old ones don't necessarily go away, they more get incorporated into the new narratives. And so during the Middle Ages, we see narratives of blood libel emerging, narratives about Jews, again, being associated with the devil. But interestingly enough, we also, during the early modern period, have new ideas about Orientalism coming onto the stage. And I argue in my book that, in fact, one of the main reasons that Jews are cloistered in the ghetto in Venice has to do with the new ways in which the Jewish body was being seen in the Western world. So there was a transition taking place in the early modern era from this perception of Jews as being associated with this religious what's the word I want to use? With this religious basis embedded in there, focused on the fact that Jews were, quote, responsible for killing Jesus, and this notion that I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought a little bit. The notion that the shift from this religious basis to the Jewish body, which was taking place in the 1300s, early 1400s, coincides with shifts towards a Jewish body, believing that Jews were seen now as threatening but alluring, as sensual, as a framework that is framed through an Eastern lens. And so I'm drawing from the scholarship of Edward Said and his notion that the West, the Occident, defines itself in juxtaposition to defining the Orient as different and primitive and exotic. And Jews are framed during this time period. And this, of course, is the period when Shakespeare is writing, and we get the image of the Shylock emerging in Western culture, and we get new images of Jews in Christianity that are associating with Jews with the past and with the devil and the Christ. So we have this merging of Orientalism with the anti-Semitism. And in the early 17th century, we also have the emergence of new ideas about race classifications. So these new racial classifications, in fact, see Jews within a framework of being non-Western. And so when you look at these early classifications, Jews have often been classified through Lamarckian science as what he referred to as a historic race. And Lamarck distinguished historic races that he thought were changeable because of environment and of history. He distinguished those kinds of races from what he saw as natural races, which is what he defined the Africans or the Negroes as. So natural races were bounded and unchanging, whereas these historic races could be changed by time and environment. And those ideas about Jews being racially different morph into scientific racism in the 19th century as we shift to Darwinian thinking. So I try to show in my book this framework of East and West, primitive and modern, is folded into our understandings of racial difference. And what is unique in the world of the narrative historically, it is not until the 19th century or the really beginning of the 20th century did the West start debating whether or not Jews were part of this larger white or quote Caucasian family. And as the color line is drawn, solidified in the late 19th century, American Jewish intellectuals like Horace Cayton and others framed Jews through a pluralistic framework, saying that Jews could be modern and American, they could become American and still be Jewish, thus the notion of a pluralistic hyphenated identity of being Jewish and American. And it's that framework of framing Jews as an ethnic group that allowed Americans to reconceptualize Jews in the American context as, quote, white people. But meanwhile, the scientific racism of the late 19th century, the rise in eugenics, the rise in anti-Semitism, if we think of the US and Germany on parallel courses, and the US sort of becoming the deviant, so to speak, the one place in the world where now Jews from Europe are going to be perceived as part of the white family. Meanwhile, in Nazi Germany, there's a doubling down on the attempt to racialize Jews. So what we're looking at is this interesting conundrum of mid-century, where Jews are highly racialized in Germany, yet in the post-war America are seen at least as contextual white people. And of course, we debate to degree to how sticky that whiteness is for Jews, because as we see the rise in violence against Jews in synagogues over the past few years suggests that this whiteness might be contextual and might not be something that is completely integrated with the privilege of whiteness that Jews, in a sense, have been able to enjoy by the decline in anti-Semitism in America. So we're left with this conundrum of, on the one hand, some folks saying, well, Jews must be white and therefore can't claim any defense of anti-Semitism or being a minority group in the United States. And thus we get this interesting conflation of Jews as white folks with the very folks of white supremacists who have been historically oppressing Jews. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a very complicated narrative that intertwines both Jews and black people as the groups by which Christian states define themselves. So in the early days, Europe defines itself in opposition to groups that are seen as alien to Europe. And in the Americas, race becomes the framework by which we define who is inside and who is outside. And so we're left with this conundrum of politics where, on the one hand, Jews are still persecuted across the globe and killed in synagogues. On the other hand, we have a political conversation that associates Jews as the settler colonists, which essentially turns them into the very white colonists that have created the notion of white supremacy in the first place. So in a sense, it's white supremacy that's at the heart of bringing together this dilemma of anti-Semitism and racism here in the United States. And it's not a coincidence, I argue, that anytime you see white nationalism rise its head here in the United States, both blacks and Jews, whether they're actually present or not, are the object by which people are defining their political identities. I think that's probably why I should stop here, open it up for questions. It's really exciting to be here with you. I can talk a lot more, but I don't want to be the rambling professor. I'd love to open this up for conversation if you'd love to do so. Thanks so much. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. So, one of the things that we're going to do now is that we're going to give people a chance to ask questions. If you're joining us virtually, I'll monitor the chat. If you're here, you can always ask a question and I will moderate. We're hearing, Bruce, things through your speaker. So if you can mute unless you're speaking.
Sure.
Perfect. So I actually have a first question, which is, Bruce, Professor Haynes, when we spoke.
Please call me Bruce. That's totally fine.
Yeah. When we spoke earlier, you talked about the fact that you had an interesting journey here, and that part of the reason that you care about this issue is because it's wrapped up in your own personal story. And so I actually want to just throw that out before we hear from anyone else, because you began to tell me about it, and I think it's a fascinating thing, because it's worth understanding that the intersection between racism and anti-Semitism is found in many different ways, but also I think with the experience of Jews of color who walk into a synagogue, Jews of color who were born Jewish, and people of color who are married to Jews, like lots of different iterations. But I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why this issue and a little bit about your history too. Now you're muted.
I'm on mute. There we go. I guess it begins with me being born and raised in Harlem, New York. Ironically, it was in 1968 when blacks and Jews were fighting over education in New York that I was mugged in the public school and sent to a private school downtown on 96th Street, a kind of experimental school. It was called the Emerson School. It had a black principal who happened to be from the Children's Television Workshop, so it was a very unusual place. It was a relatively integrated school with very small classes. So my first best friend became a young man named Jack Neff, who I've been friends with for, I guess, some close to 50 years now. Jack still lives down in LA. He came out to California with me. And so very early on in my life, I had intimate relationships with Jewish community in New York. I had friends, I had girlfriends. But more than that, after high school, I went to college, a small Catholic college, had little contact with Jews, came out looking for a job, and wound up working for my best friend's father, who happened to be Jewish, in transportation in Manhattan. And then I found a gentleman by the name of Jay Shulman, who was selecting juries in New York, and he was a sociologist, and so I started working for him part-time. Needless to say, Jay became my mentor. He encouraged me to go to graduate school. I never would have gone had it not been for him. So not only did I learn applied sociology, he supported me through my graduate education. And then after all of that, I married the woman I fell in love with, happened to be Jewish. So the next thing I know, in 1995, when I went to my first job at Yale University, we moved to New Haven, and I thought of her as a sort of typical New York Jew who did high holy days and didn't belong to any shul. And the next thing she told me we had to join one, and I joined a conservadox congregation with her in New Haven. And so now I'm the black guy who writes about race, living in New Haven, or actually in Trumbull, but working in New Haven and attending a synagogue in New Haven, and seeing black people in the synagogue who were Jews, and paying attention to the public conversation that was taking place in the media with Louis Farrakhan and Conrad Muhammad kind of at the center of controversy. And so I was approached by Philip Kasinitz, a scholar at CUNY Graduate Center, who had worked, it's sort of a funny story, with another Jewish scholar, Sharon Zukin. Sharon was my advisor in graduate school, and Phil Kasinitz was a big star coming down from, I believe it was from Wesleyan he was coming from, and he came to CUNY Grad Center and asked me about writing something about Black-Jewish conflict that was taking place on 125th Street. And so we wrote a piece called The Fire at Freddy's, and we deconstructed the media's narrative about the ongoing conflict between, quote, blacks and Jews. And we showed that the conflict that was taking place in New York at the time was actually between Caribbean immigrants and Jewish immigrants, as opposed to kind of historic Ashkenazi Jews and Southern migrants, sort of the classic black and Jewish folks who people are used to thinking about. And so that got me thinking about this whole black-Jewish dynamic, and where are the voices of these people who are meeting who were telling me that they were Jews. And I grew up in Harlem, and as I said, went to prep school that was largely Jewish, and I did not meet any black Jews in those contexts. In '73, I went to bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, and so I was very much exposed to Jewish New York. And now suddenly I was beginning to see that there were black people who were Jews, and that became a curiosity. So literally, that became my project, interviewing these people, trying to figure out who are these people who are now living in this context as Jews, in a context where people say to be black and to be Jewish is mutually exclusive.
So if you've got questions, come on up to the front because I want you to be seen on the camera. And if we want to just, Professor Haynes, when we speak, just mute yourself. Perfect. So Roger, if you want to come up, Lee, and then we'll take a question or two from online.
Hi, Professor, and thank you so much for joining us from my home state. I was wondering if you would comment, as I'm hearing you think or speak, I'm thinking about how so often, with the rise of nationalism in this country, so often Jews are seen as not authentic Americans, sort of as posers, right? Or as, at least that's what I hear the narrative from the white nationalists. Your experience as being an African American and also being Jewish, I can only imagine that you have a similar kind of experience when you, just now you said it's being Jewish and being African American is sort of mutually exclusive. Do you see sort of a parallel, maybe this is your whole talk and I'm just repeating it back to you, but do you see that parallel between those two strands of, Jews as being perceived by white nationalists as not really being authentic Americans, as being sort of folks who are after something else, and your experience as a Jewish African American?
I think that's a great question. Thank you for that. I mean, it's almost the conundrum of Jews being seen as white and not white. So on the one hand, if a person of color like myself ends up in a synagogue context or a Jewish context, we might be challenged and say, well, why are you here? Are you Jewish? When I first was involved in the Jewish community, that used to happen quite a bit. Now, I should also tell you, I have not actually formally converted. And so technically, I don't consider myself Jewish, despite the fact that I've been so immersed in Jewish context. But nevertheless, I was able to draw from my own experiences because I have become more and more engaged and involved personally within the Jewish community. The people who I interviewed often told me about these kinds of experiences. People use terms like feeling like a mascot, for instance, at their synagogue, particularly for the generation growing up in the 70s and 80s. And so keep in mind, I was interviewing folks in the 1990s, and their children now are coming of age in their early 20s. And so for me, it's quite fascinating watching the transformation across the generations as more space has been created for Jews of color to make claim as Jews. Because 20 years ago, I think the curiosity was far greater. When I first started my project, people often made fun of me and said, "Oh, so you're studying Sammy Davis, huh?" As if, there's only one black Jew on the planet. People don't make that joke so much anymore. People are much more aware of the vast diversity of Jews in America, and some of that is because Jews of color have become much more vocal as a collective.
So we'll call up Lee, and since we're on the topic anyways, and Lee, you can take a seat. There is a question in the chat that is, I think, in line with what you were speaking about, which is, as you've done this research, what's one or two things that really surprised you as you learned more about the experience of Jews of color? And you're muted.
I guess the first thing that comes to mind is how many people were converting. I didn't really think of Jews as converting. The literature and religion actually does not talk about Jews as converting. In fact, one of the things I talk about in my book is that the scholarship on conversion is so dominated by the Christian narrative that they only talk about the Pauline narrative as conversion. And that essentially means that you have an epiphany one day and you wake up and decide you're going to have right. But that was not the narrative for my Jews of color. My black Jews often were connected to the community in organic ways like I have been. They were married, or they were connected, or they had friends in school and they were attending a synagogue, and the next thing they were taken by the music or taken by some aspect of religious practice that often drew them in. And so I talked about the Ruth narrative as the basis for conversion to Judaism. In other words, your people or my people was a better framework, the notion that you kind of hung out with a community and slowly became incorporated into it over time to the point where now you felt you were an insider. That was much more the trajectory of my black Jews for conversion. I'm not sure if that answered your question or not, but.
Thank you. So, Lee.
Okay, hi, Professor. Just wanted to also note at the start that there's a multicultural and Jews of color Facebook group that is worth subscribing to. It's taught me a lot. And you might be aware of it, and for people here, it's worth digging into and locating. And they post a lot. Okay, I first just observed that for people of my generation who are Ashkenazi Jews, I notice a divide sometimes. Like I'm not an immigrant, and I'm very comfortable and it seems obvious to me that I'm both Jewish and white, because I have no problem acknowledging and dealing with the issue that I enjoy white privilege, but meeting other people who are immigrants, Jews who come from countries where the anti-Semitism is at least until recently more pronounced than in the U.S., feel like they've just got here, they've come from a situation where they feel like they've been oppressed or struggling, and then they get classified as having white privilege, and it's offensive to them. And so I've kind of discovered this difference, and I wonder if you've discovered that too, between people who are here for a long time and people who are more recently here. But my main question is just about, I wonder how you dealing with Jews of African descent with the question of Sephardic Jews who are from North Africa, and are you thinking mainly of people who are of sub-Saharan African background? And if just when you think about Israeli Jews, a full 50% of which I think at least are Sephardic, their colorism works. Our notions about race and color are going to have to work differently in that context, and I wonder how that impacts on your research, how you deal with the question of North African Sephardic Jews, and just that larger question of thinking about that classification.
And I think we're going to make this our final question.
Thank you for that question. It's kind of complicated, but I'll see if I can do justice to it. I think the first half of your question surrounds the conflation of both Jews with whiteness, but also Jewishness with European culture. So the notion that sort of Jewishness in America is so defined by Yiddishkeit and the European experience that many people don't really know there are other Jews in the world, ironically. When I talk to non-Jews about the Jewish community, I'm actually sometimes pretty shocked about what people don't know about the Jewish community. The second part, I think, is a really interesting question you asked about sub-Saharan Africa and Jews of color and black Jews. For my project, I was looking at people here in the United States that self-identified both as black and as Jewish. And that meant I got a wide variety of people. Some were Ethiopian, some were converts, some were born Jews. But the notion of Jews of color raises a whole nother conversation. And I say that because the notion of JOC, Jews of color, is many people who are Jews of color don't self-identify as Jews of color. So let's say that. They might identify as a Latino Jew or an Asian American Jew or a black Jew, but they don't think of themselves as a Jew of color per se, even though people use the terminology when trying to talk about non-white Jews. And so the term Jew of color, many people from Northern Africa might not consider themselves a Jew of color. They might define themselves as Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews and not identify as a Jew of color. And at the same time, some who are of color from those places do identify as a Jew of color. And so the term Jew of color can be very confusing. I think what's more important is to think about the way in which race operates here in the United States, the way in which whiteness has made non-white Jews invisible, and the fact that the Jewish community, both through marriage, intermarriage, conversion, adoption, all of these ways, and through immigration from the global south, right, from Yemen and other places, in all of these ways, the American Jewish community is becoming increasingly diverse. That to me is sort of the reality. So it's not just, the 2 or 3% of black Jews who are now present in the Jewish community that maybe 30 years ago we might not have seen. But we're talking about a larger percentage, maybe 15% of the American Jewish community that now self-identifies as non-white. That includes a lot of folks from a lot of places. And so the notion of whiteness, compounded by the politics of are Ashkenazi Jews white in the first place, has raised the question of whiteness in a big, big way for the Jewish community, as the Jewish community tries to navigate the reality of a white society and the reality of anti-Semitism that still exists in that white society.
Thank you very much. I don't know
Thank
if
you
you
all
heard
for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard everybody applauding to you, but it's so wonderful to have you here, to be able to have this technology, to have it work. So again, some thank yous again to Shirley Colbert for sponsoring tonight, for Bud and Carrie for brainstorming and making tonight happen. And also, I was reminded, a big thank you, and I hadn't thanked her at the beginning, to Joanna Lukes, who was the one who originally brought you here to be on that panel for the movie. And so thank you to Joanna for making this happen even many months ago. So again, Jews of African Descent, if you want to read Professor Haynes's book. Thank you for so much tonight, for all the insight. Feel free, if you're joining us virtually, to put thanks into the chat as well. And if you're here, get a little nosh. And part of the reason that we feel like it's a great idea to do something like this is because you can immediately then begin to process over some cheese and crackers. And so if you feel comfortable eating, we would love for you to stick around. Just so you know kind of the plan in general, we're going to spend the next few weeks getting used to eating together, and then we're going to explore the idea of taking off the mask. And as quickly as we start to feel comfortable with eating, we'll move toward the mask. So we're going to kind of take our cue from watching the body language and how many people will stay, and that's going to determine the timeline to when the masks are coming off. So with that, thank you, and Shabbat Shalom, everyone.